All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're taking a completely analytical look at how a story actually manages to terrify us. We're going to deconstruct the anatomy of a horror movie shot. But we aren't just talking about where a camera is placed here. We're talking about how a shot is built directly in your mind using isolated auditory cues, agonizing pacing, and the really insidious corruption of family bonds. Just take a second and let this chilling line from a mummification tape featured in the source material sink in. It's so unsettling, right? It isn't just a scary piece of dialogue, it's honestly the thematic anchor for this entire analysis. It perfectly sets up the stakes, telling us right off the bat that we are dealing with an ancient ritual where human life, and specifically the innocence of a child, is just treated as raw, disposable material for survival.
So, that brings us to the core question driving our explainer today. How exactly does a story use isolated audio and specific pacing to craft the perfect, horrifying shot in our minds long before we ever actually lay eyes on a monster? Because a truly effective horror narrative knows that what you imagine in the dark is literally always worse than what they can show you in the light.
Section 1. Anatomy of an inciting incident.
Every great horror setup grounds itself in real-world fears, like child abduction, before it even touches the supernatural. And you really have to notice the stark, uncanny valley contrast here. Before she was lured away in Cairo by a mysterious woman named Lila using some simple magic tricks, Katie was this vibrant kid, playfully arguing with her brother Seb, declaring Taylor Swift an absolute angel, begging for candy. But after she's found, having been smuggled in a 3,000-year-old basalt sarcophagus, the transformation is horrifying. She returns locked in deep catatonia, suffering from severe malnutrition, showing erratic physical tics, and even inflicting deep scratches on her own skin. The story brilliantly anchors our dread right there in that severe physical and mental degradation.
Moving on to Section 2, Building Terror Through Sound. Now, what is just so brilliant about this sequence is how the narrative constructs a shot entirely out of isolated audio cues before the monster ever visually strikes. The most effective cinematic moments aren't always visual, right? First, the story isolates our senses with this faint, rhythmic thudding. It starts simple. Katie's parents, Charlie and Larissa, are forced to just listen in the dark. It's a deliberate, agonizing slow burn that literally makes you lean in, forcing your imagination to build a mental picture of something horrible hidden inside the walls of their family home.
Then, the pacing ramps up, and the sound evolves into this incredibly sinister teeth chattering. It ratchets up the tension exponentially as Charlie and Larissa are scrambling in the dark, calling out for Katie. This rhythmic, unnatural clicking creates a deeply claustrophobic atmosphere. You can practically feel the panic in the room, proving how auditory horror can just completely overwhelm our senses. And finally, the auditory horror crescendos with this visceral squelching sound as the demonic presence fully manifests. It's such a grotesque noise, and it proves that the most terrifying shots are often heard way before they're seen. By the time the visual of the possessed Katie finally catches up to the audio, the audience and the parents are already in a state of absolute panic. That sound design effectively did the work of a dozen visual jump scares.
All right, Section 3, the Nazmaranian mythology.
To truly understand what is systematically destroying this family, we need to look at the lore uncovered by Professor Bixler. He decodes these ancient hieratic bindings, which is the first cursive script of ancient Egypt, and he discovers this word, Nazmaranian. This completely reframes our horror shot from a simple haunting into an ancient apocalyptic threat. It acts not just as a physical monster, but as the ultimate destroyer of the family unit itself. It moved as a shadow amongst the living before people even had words for that kind of terror. The horror is deeply psychological. It takes the people you trust the absolute most and weaponizes them against you.
Notice these specific traits on how it breaks down Katie's siblings. It perfectly mirrors the cancerous rot it brings to communities. It travels like a sickness of the soul. It acts as a whisper in the ear, planting seeds of suspicion. And most tragically, it creates cruelty right where love once lived. When the possessed Katie violently taunts her brother Seb or attacks her grandmother, it is a systematic dismantling of their familial bonds. It literally feeds on love by corrupting it entirely.
Next up, Section 4, the 82 Rituals.
The true, horrifying scale of this cycle is revealed when Charlie's ally in Cairo, Zaki, uncovers a terrifying VHS tape of Katie's kidnapper. Up until this point, we might have viewed Katie's abduction as a tragic but isolated incident. But the tape shows her kidnapping wasn't isolated at all. It was actually the 80-second secret mummification ritual meant to contain the demon. 82! That single number radically widens the lens of our horror narrative, exposing a cycle of innocent sacrifice that's been repeating for millennia.
And a translated diary actually tries to justify this atrocity. The kidnapper writes that they are honored to carry this responsibility to transfer the demon from a spent vessel into a freshly prepared host. The real horror shot here isn't a monster jumping out of a closet, it's this massive, crushing narrative revelation. Katie wasn't just abducted, she was meticulously prepared as a living tomb to contain an ancient evil.
Which brings us to Section 5, the final twist.
Everything the narrative has built, the claustrophobic audio, the terrifying mythology, the breakdown of the family unit, it all crashes together here in a totally chaotic and bloody conclusion. As the possessed Katie violently attacks, the demonic entity completely overpowers the family. Amidst the roaring wind and the violence, Zaki desperately recites ancient words of protection. Finally, realizing the horrific stakes, Charlie sacrifices himself in a frantic struggle, telling them to let her go because it's her turn. It is just a heartbreaking sequence driven by sacrifice.
But here is the chilling final twist that perfectly executes the demon's ultimate goal. The entity taunts Charlie with a twisted revelation. I'm her daddy now. The Nazmaranian didn't just take his daughter's body, it completely usurped his role as the protector. It destroyed the family hierarchy, leaving Charlie with the horrifying realization that his sacrifice was met with nothing but profound psychological torture. So, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to take away from this explainer today. Since the ancient rituals only pass the Nazmaranian to a new host, where and when will the 83rd ritual take place? The horror doesn't truly end, does it? It merely waits for a fresh vessel. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the anatomy of a terrifying narrative. Keep analyzing the stories you consume, and I'll see you on the next explainer.